Most people believe a heart attack announces itself with drama. Crushing chest pain. An arm going numb. A sudden collapse. That is what films show. That is the image that has been culturally reinforced for decades. But in my experience working in cardiovascular medicine, the most dangerous cardiac events after the age of 60 are not the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones. The ones that build slowly and silently in the dark. No warning. No time to reach for a phone. No opportunity to call for help. And no second chance. What genuinely shocks people when I share this with them is not the statistics. It is the cause. Because the events I am describing are almost always triggered not by something extraordinary, but by something completely routine. Something unremarkable. Something you did last night before you turned off the bedside lamp and closed your eyes. My name is Katherine. I have spent more than 2 decades working in cardiovascular medicine, studying the patterns that lead otherwise ordinary evenings to become the last ones people remember. And in that time, I have watched the same preventable sequences repeat themselves with a consistency that is both heartbreaking and, importantly, completely reversible. Tonight I am going to walk you through 5 of those patterns. 5 evening habits that are quietly loading a gun while you sleep. And then I am going to show you exactly how to unload it, one simple and sustainable habit at a time. Stay with me through this entire conversation. What you understand in the next 20 minutes may genuinely be the most important information you receive this year. Here is something that most people have never been told about sleep and the cardiovascular system. Your heart does not rest when you fall asleep. It shifts into a different operating mode. In a young, healthy body, nighttime is when blood pressure naturally declines, typically 10 to 20% lower than it runs during waking hours. Heart rate slows. The arteries relax and soften. This is a biological maintenance cycle, a nightly reset that the body has been running throughout your life to repair and recover the cardiovascular system. But after 60, this system becomes measurably less reliable. Blood vessel walls stiffen with age. The mechanisms your body uses to regulate pressure become less precise. The hormonal signals that used to protect the heart during sleep begin to weaken. And the margin for error in all of this becomes significantly smaller than it was even a decade earlier. During the day, your cardiovascular system has backup mechanisms available. It can compensate. It can adapt to unexpected demands. At night, many of those compensatory mechanisms are essentially offline. Your body is running on reduced support. That is what makes the nighttime hours categorically different after 60. That is why the window between midnight and 6 in the morning carries the highest statistical risk of heart attack and stroke for people in this age group. Not the afternoon. Not the busy morning hours. The quiet hours. The hours when no one is watching but your habits are. And here is what changes everything about that picture. What happens during those dangerous nighttime hours is largely determined by what you did before you went to bed. The meal you ate. The medication you took or did not take. The temperature you left the room at. Choices that felt completely routine and completely inconsequential. That is what we are going to examine, starting right now with the habit that produces the most surprise in the people I share it with. Let me ask you a direct question. What time did you eat your last meal yesterday evening? And what was on that plate? I ask every patient I see a version of that question. And for a significant number of people over 60, the answer involves eating somewhere around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, sometimes later. A substantial meal, pasta, rice, a generous portion of meat, something fried, perhaps dessert, followed by settling onto the couch for an hour or 2 and then going to bed. I understand completely why this pattern develops. Long days, family schedules, decades of established habit. But from a cardiovascular standpoint, this habit represents one of the most quietly harmful things you can do to your heart on a regular basis. Here is what is happening inside your body when you eat a large late meal. Digesting a substantial amount of food requires an enormous increase in blood flow to the gastrointestinal system. Your heart must pump harder and faster to meet that demand. Blood pressure rises in response. Triglycerides, the circulating fats in your bloodstream, spike sharply within 2 to 4 hours after eating. Now consider what you are layering this on top of. Your body is expecting the evening hours to represent a wind down, a gradual easing of cardiovascular demand as you approach sleep. Instead, your heart is simultaneously trying to manage a full digestive emergency while attempting to shift into its nighttime recovery mode. Those two demands are in direct and significant conflict. In a person over 60 with any degree of arterial stiffness or existing plaque, that conflict carries real and measurable consequences. Research has consistently shown that eating within 2 to 3 hours of sleep is associated with elevated nighttime blood pressure, higher rates of acid reflux that can mimic and sometimes trigger cardiac symptoms, and increased risk of cardiovascular events during the sleeping hours. The practical correction is straightforward. Aim to finish your main evening meal by 6 or 7 o'clock. If you eat anything later than that, keep it genuinely light. Lean protein and vegetables rather than heavy fats and large carbohydrate portions. That single timing adjustment gives your heart the hours it needs to settle before it is asked to enter recovery mode. Does your current dinner schedule look like what I just described? You would be surprised how many people immediately recognize themselves in that pattern and have never once connected it to their heart health. Now I need you to give this next one serious attention because this is where some of the most consistently preventable cardiac damage originates, and it involves something that affects the majority of people over 60 in some form. If you take medication for high blood pressure, and statistically more than 60% of people in this age group do, the timing of when you take that medication matters enormously. More than most physicians take the time to explain, and more than most patients ever think to ask about. For most people, blood pressure follows a predictable daily arc. It rises in the morning, peaks in the mid-afternoon, and then dips as evening approaches and the body prepares for sleep. But a significant proportion of people over 60, particularly those managing hypertension, do not experience that nighttime pressure drop. Their blood pressure either remains elevated throughout the night or, more dangerously, surges during the early morning hours when the body is transitioning toward waking. This condition is called nocturnal hypertension, and the vast majority of people who have it have never heard the term. Nocturnal hypertension is more dangerous in specific ways than daytime high blood pressure, and here is why. During sleep, the arterial walls are not in their braced, active state. They are relaxed, which makes them more vulnerable. A pressure surge at 3 in the morning strikes arterial walls very differently than the same pressure surge at 3 in the afternoon. It is more likely to destabilize and rupture vulnerable plaque sitting inside a coronary artery. More likely to trigger the clot formation sequence that leads to a heart attack. More likely to send someone from their bedroom to an emergency table. If you take your blood pressure medication exclusively in the morning, it may have largely worn off by the time you enter the most vulnerable hours of the night. If you occasionally miss a dose, you may be leaving yourself completely unprotected during precisely the period when that protection matters most. A major clinical investigation known as the Hygia chronotherapy trial found that evening dosing of blood pressure medication significantly reduces cardiovascular risk during sleep compared to morning dosing. That is not a minor pharmacological detail. That is a potentially life-altering piece of information that most patients over 60 have never had a conversation with their doctor about. What I am asking you to do is simple. At your next appointment, ask your physician specifically whether the timing of your blood pressure medication should be reconsidered. Ask whether evening dosing might be more appropriate for your situation. That conversation takes approximately 2 minutes. It could represent the most important medical exchange you have this year. I want you to think carefully about the next one. Think about whether it applies to someone in your household, or perhaps to yourself. Does someone in your life snore? Not occasional light snoring, but the loud, irregular, sometimes gasping kind that causes the person beside them to lie awake listening with concern. Most households treat that sound as an annoyance, as a source of exasperated humor, as something to elbow a partner awake over in the middle of the night. In my clinical practice, I treat it as a cardiac warning signal until a proper evaluation proves otherwise. Sleep apnea is one of the most significantly underdiagnosed conditions I encounter in patients over 60. Estimates suggest that more than 30% of older adults have some form of it. The overwhelming majority have never been diagnosed, have never been treated, and have no understanding of what is happening to their cardiovascular system during every night they sleep with this condition unaddressed. Here is what actually occurs during an apnea episode. The person stops breathing. It might last 10 seconds. It might last 40 seconds or longer. This can happen dozens of times in a single hour throughout the night. Each time the oxygen level in the blood drops, the brain registers a physiological emergency and fires off an immediate stress response. Adrenaline and cortisol surge. Heart rate spikes. Blood pressure jumps sharply. The heart is essentially jolted into an emergency state while the rest of the person remains asleep. And then it happens again. And again. 30, 40, 50 times before morning. The cumulative cardiovascular consequences of that pattern sustained night after night across years are not subtle. Sleep apnea is directly associated with a 3 times higher risk of heart attack compared to people without the condition. It is strongly linked to atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm that dramatically elevates stroke risk. It accelerates the thickening and stiffening of arterial walls. And because all of it happens during sleep, the person frequently has no awareness that anything is occurring until something serious brings them to medical attention. The warning signs are not always as obvious as dramatic snoring. Watch for waking with headaches that were not present when you went to sleep. Feeling genuinely exhausted even after what should have been a full night of rest. Needing to urinate frequently during the night. Waking with a dry mouth or a sensation of having briefly choked or gasped. Any one of those patterns warrants a conversation with your physician about a sleep evaluation. If you snore heavily, if you are over 60, and if you have any history of heart disease or elevated cardiovascular risk, getting properly evaluated for sleep apnea is not an optional wellness consideration. It is a fundamental component of taking your cardiac health seriously. The most common treatment, a CPAP device, is admittedly not elegant. But the data on what consistent CPAP use does for cardiovascular health is genuinely remarkable. Patients who use it correctly show measurable reductions in blood pressure, lower rates of atrial fibrillation, and significantly reduced overall cardiac risk. One device, one habit, substantial and documented protection for the heart you are depending on every single night. This fourth habit is driven by reasoning that is completely logical, and that is precisely what makes it so easy to overlook and so easy to never question. Many people over 60 deliberately limit how much fluid they consume in the evening. The reasoning is entirely understandable. They want to avoid waking at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom. Disrupted sleep is uncomfortable and exhausting. Getting out of bed at night also increases the risk of falls, which is a legitimate safety concern in this age group. So they stop drinking fluids after dinner. Sometimes earlier. Sometimes by 4 in the afternoon. The intention makes sense. But from a cardiovascular perspective, going to bed even mildly dehydrated represents a meaningful and underappreciated risk factor that almost no one discusses. When your body is dehydrated, the blood becomes more viscous, thicker, less fluid. It moves through vessels with more resistance and less ease. For a young cardiovascular system with flexible, healthy arteries, this represents a manageable inconvenience. For a person over 60 managing arterial stiffness, elevated blood pressure, and possibly some degree of plaque accumulation, it is a considerably more serious situation. Thicker blood moving through already narrowed arteries is more prone to forming clots. And the timing problem compounds this in a way most people have never considered. During sleep, your heart rate naturally decreases. Blood moves more slowly through the system as a consequence. Now combine that slower circulation with thicker blood in a body that has been lying completely still for 7 or 8 hours while gravity provides no additional assistance to circulation. That convergence, mild dehydration, reduced heart rate, physical stillness, and vessels that are already less than fully open, is one of the primary physiological reasons that strokes and heart attacks cluster in the early morning hours rather than distributing themselves evenly across the day. The correction is simple and requires no significant lifestyle adjustment. Drink a full glass of water before you get into bed. 8 ounces. That is all. Enough to ensure your blood is not unnecessarily thickening during the hours when your circulation is already at its slowest. Keep a second glass on the nightstand. That moment of mild thirst that wakes you at 2 in the morning is your body communicating something that your heart also needs. You do not have to choose between protecting your sleep and protecting your cardiovascular system. A small amount of water accomplishes both. The fifth and final habit surprises almost everyone I mention it to, because it sounds almost too minor to matter. And yet the cardiovascular data behind it is consistent and clear. What temperature is your bedroom right now? Most people have never once considered that question in relation to their heart health. They think about personal comfort. They think about whether they tend to sleep warm or cool. They adjust the thermostat based on how they feel. But there is a specific temperature range that your cardiovascular system functions optimally within during sleep, and outside of that range your heart is quietly working harder than it needs to be across every single hour of the night. Consider what happens when the room is too warm, above approximately 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Your body works continuously throughout the night to dissipate excess heat. Blood vessels stay dilated and the heart rate remains elevated to support that process. Sweating causes fluid loss, which brings the dehydration issue directly back into the picture. And most importantly, sleep quality degrades. You spend less time in the deep, slow-wave stages of sleep where the heart and cardiovascular system receive their most restorative overnight recovery. Less deep sleep means less repair, less recovery, and a heart that enters each new day slightly less restored than it should be. Now consider the opposite extreme. A bedroom that is genuinely cold, below approximately 16 or 17 degrees Celsius. Cold exposure causes vasoconstriction, the tightening of blood vessel walls as the body attempts to preserve core temperature. Blood pressure rises in response. The heart is working against increased resistance. For someone with existing coronary artery disease or hypertension, that sustained nighttime pressure increase is not a trivial concern. The optimal range for both sleep quality and cardiovascular protection is between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius, or roughly 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Within that band, your body remains in what physiologists call thermoneutral territory. Vessels stay appropriately relaxed. Heart rate settles low and steady. Sleep progresses through its full restorative cycle. One thermostat setting, adjusted thoughtfully, provides genuine and consistent protection at no cost and no complexity. Now let me bring all 5 together and give you something concrete and actionable to carry out of this conversation, because a list of problems without a clear path forward does not protect anyone. Think of what follows as an evening structure built specifically around cardiac protection, and notice how naturally it fits into an ordinary life without requiring any dramatic changes to who you are or how you live. Between 6 and 7 in the evening, that is your window for the main meal of the day. Lean protein, vegetables, a moderate and sensible portion of carbohydrates if your body needs them. Not an elaborate feast and not a punishing fast. A proper, adequate dinner eaten at a reasonable hour that gives your heart a full 3 to 4 hours to settle before you ask it to enter sleep mode. At around the same time, address your medications. If you have never had a specific conversation with your physician about whether evening dosing of your blood pressure medication might be more appropriate for your situation, make a note to raise it at your next appointment. That conversation is 2 minutes long and may represent the most protective medical discussion you have this year. Between 8 and 9 in the evening, create a genuine wind-down period. A gentle walk. Quiet reading. A calm conversation with someone you care about. This is the hour to move away from bright screens, particularly the close, high-intensity light of phone and tablet screens, which suppress melatonin production and keep the nervous system in an alert state far longer than is beneficial before sleep. Your heart, like the rest of your body, needs the signal that the active portion of the day is genuinely ending. By 9 o'clock, spend 90 seconds preparing your sleep environment. Adjust the thermostat to within the optimal range. Open a window briefly if the weather allows. Place a glass of water on the nightstand. These take almost no time and they address 2 of the 5 habits we discussed in a single deliberate action. By 10, you are in bed. And here is one final detail that costs nothing and requires no equipment. If you snore, if you have been told you stop breathing during sleep, or if you wake feeling unrest despite adequate hours of sleep, try sleeping on your side rather than on your back. Back sleeping significantly worsens airway obstruction and the frequency of apnea episodes. A simple positional change can meaningfully reduce that obstruction while you pursue a formal sleep evaluation through your physician. Dinner by 7. Medication timing discussed with your doctor. A genuine wind down between 8 and 9. Room prepared by 9. In bed by 10, on your side if there is any concern about airway obstruction. That is the complete structure. Simple enough that it requires no significant reorganization of your life. Protective enough that the research behind each component is clear and consistent. I want to share something with you directly before we close, not as someone creating content, but as someone who has spent 2 decades watching what happens when this information does not reach people in time. The patterns I described tonight are not exotic or rare. They are not unusual combinations of bad luck and medical misfortune. They are the ordinary background of millions of evenings in millions of homes. A dinner eaten too late. A blood pressure medication always taken in the morning without anyone ever questioning the timing. A spouse's snoring accepted as an inevitability rather than evaluated as a cardiac signal. A glass of water skipped to avoid a midnight bathroom trip. A bedroom left a few degrees too warm for comfort. Each of these, in isolation, sounds minor. Accumulated night after night, year after year, in a cardiovascular system that is working with narrower margins than it had at 40, they become something else entirely. The hearts that have needed the most serious intervention in my experience did not fail because of mysterious or unavoidable causes. They failed because of information their owners never had. Information that, if it had reached them in time, would have led to different choices on different evenings, and to different outcomes. You now have that information. The question that matters is not whether this knowledge is useful. It clearly is. The question is what you choose to do with it tonight. Not at your next checkup. Not when things feel more convenient. Tonight. Which of these 5 habits do you recognize in yourself or in someone you love? I am genuinely asking. Leave your answer in the comments below. You would be surprised how much company you have in those answers, and how much changes when people realize that what they have been treating as minor and unremarkable actually deserves to be taken seriously. If this video gave you something genuinely useful, please share it. There is almost certainly someone in your life who is over 60 and who has never once connected their evening routine to their cardiac risk. Send this to them. That single action may matter more than you realize. Everything I have shared today is grounded in current cardiovascular research and clinical experience. It is not a replacement for your personal medical care, and any changes to your medication schedule in particular should be made in conversation with your own physician. That is not a disclaimer. That is genuine advice from someone who wants you watching this channel and living fully for many years to come. Take care of your heart. It has been working for you without pause, without rest, without complaint, every single minute of every single night of your entire life. Give it the conditions it needs to keep going. Good night. Sleep well. And take care of yourself starting right now.